Welcome, everyone, to the special educational webinar, Understanding the Complicated History of American Jews in America's Civil War. The Society for the Preservation of Jewish Civil War History is proud to introduce our prestigious panel today. Our very special guests include P. Michael Jones, Executive Director of the General John A. Logan Museum, Michael Rugel, Director of Programs and Content at the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, Christopher J. Sniezek, Development Coordinator of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy Jr., U.S. Army retired, author and speaker, U.S. Military Academy at West Point, certified Army professional historian, and former graduate history assistant professor at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Michael Givens, producer, director of cinematography of Michael Givens and Associates, Acting and Film Institute. His current project is This Happy Land in post-production. Dr. Anne McLean, art historian, author, speaker, and educator. And Dr. Michael Kogan, Professor Emeritus, Philosophy and Religion, Montclair State University. And I'm your host today, L.M. Siegel, and I'm moderating on behalf of the Society today. And I would like everyone to keep Rabbi Wisnia in their prayers. He had hoped to participate in the program today and was our co-chairman for this project, but could not be with us due to his recent medical setback. We would like to welcome members of the media and other viewers and guests. Members of the media attending today are invited to chat their questions in the chat bar on the far left of the screen, including who the question is directed to, and they will be asked and answered after the presentation. Also, the media will be sent a replay link to simplify transcription for quotation purposes. All right, with the housekeeping out of the way, let's begin. At the end of May, many Americans observe Memorial Day. So we'll begin at the end of the war, after America's fratricidal conflict, resulting in an unknown countless deaths, some estimate as many as 750,000. After the war, various efforts began to memorialize the dead. We'll start with a history of Memorial Day with a visit from Executive Director of the General John A. Logan Museum. Welcome, Mr. Jones.
Hello, I'm glad to be a part of this.
Well, we're so glad to have you. Memorial Day is coming up, the last weekend in May. Most Americans don't know about the history of Memorial Day. So who started it and why? It's very interesting.
Well, the National Memorial Day, because there is a question, is it you divide this between National and First Memorial Day. The National Memorial Day was started by Major General and member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois and Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, John A. Logan, when he issued General Order Number 11 that designated May 30th as a day to decorate the graves of Union soldiers with flowers. The Grand Army of the Republic was a very powerful force in the late 19th century, and it is the forerunner of the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Vietnam veterans that we have today.
Well, that's very interesting. So there's a lot of stories about how General Logan came to decide to begin Memorial Day. How did he originally get the idea?
Well, there's a lot of stories. It's really the story of Memorial Day. It's a very contentious story with about 24 communities claiming to have observed the first Memorial Day. Logan became involved kind of secondhand, and the National Memorial Day started 2 years after what would be the first annual Memorial Day observation in the United States. It was common knowledge, evidently, if you read newspapers, that in the 1930s, at least, and 40s, that everybody knew that Memorial Day started in the southern states. This seems to have been forgotten by the 1950s and 60s. But Columbus, Georgia, the ladies of Columbus sent out a letter asking people in the South to designate April 26th as an annual day to honor the fallen Confederate soldiers. Logan had to know about this, and he had to know about the memorial in 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina, by formerly enslaved people, because he read newspapers, and they received great wide coverage in the newspapers. But there was a reluctance on the part of the Union to copy a Confederate event. But in 1868, in spring, Mary Logan, the general's wife, visited the battlefields of Virginia and stopped at Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg, and was so touched by the flowers and withered flags from the previous 1867 Memorial Day that she went back home and told her husband the North should do something similar. And Mary was a very persuasive person. Her aunt, to this day, her descendants claim that Mary was the one who had this idea, told him that we needed to do this. He went then on May 5th, and as Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, issued General Order Number 11, Logan's Memorial Day Order, that designated May 30th as a time to decorate the graves. And that's why they called it Decoration Day to begin with. There was some pushback. You can find this in the newspapers of the time. But the holiday was generally celebrated across the United States. The Grand Army published a book of all those observations. And the next year, Logan would repeat it. It would become, from that point, an annual event.
That's a terrific story. Now, you cite some of this from a book that you mentioned. You want to share the title of that book if people are more interested in that?
There is a wonderfully researched book, although somewhat has some loaded language in it. When you read it, be aware of that. Called I got to read this. I can't ever remember. Isn't that terrible? It's The Origin of the Memorial Day Holiday in America. And it was written by Daniel Bellware and Dr. Richard Gardner. And as I say, it is very well researched. It has a great deal of primary sources, and any hypotheses they make are based on these original sources. The only thing I would fault about it is set to discredit some of the other communities who claim that they had the first Memorial Day.
Sure, there's a competition.
It is. They are Columbus, Georgia, and like I said, I read in 1930 newspapers and 1890 newspapers that Memorial Day started in Columbus, Georgia. It's a very interesting read and very well researched.
So, Mr. Jones, tell us really quickly about the museum, where it's located, some of the great history you have there.
The museum's located in Murfreesboro, Illinois, and that was Logan's birthplace. We're located within, 100 feet, 200 feet of Logan's original birthplace. And we try to tell the story of Logan and Southern Illinois in the Civil War, which grows to be Logan and the nation as he, outgrew his Southern Illinois roots and became a national figure. Deals with the fact that he is, with a lot of people, were forgotten. And we're trying to focus also on the individual soldiers and their letters and how the war affected them. We're a nice little museum, is what we are. And it's, we look at Logan, what are they saying? Not to praise him, but to interpret him. And he started out as a very racist individual because the part of Southern Illinois, the part of Illinois he came from was known as Egypt. And the people of the state, in fact, across the nation at the time, and if you get into period newspapers, thought that the people who lived here were benighted, which is a lovely word for incredibly ignorant, and also drank too much, did not care about education, and were generally rebellious. And there was great fear that this part of the state would, in fact, they did, threaten to secede, break away from the rest of Illinois and secede. So we tell all of that story, and then we tell the story of the Civil War through Logan's eyes and the changes that he made over time until his death in 1886.
Well, I look forward to hopefully one day visiting the museum, and thank you for all you're doing, keeping history alive and being with us today, and for sharing this great story. And our next guest is going to introduce us to the participation of Jewish people in the war. Mr. Rugel, your museum has an interesting mission, military Jewish history in America, all of American history, and it's really a hidden gem. Could you tell us a little bit about the museum?
Sure. We're the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. We're in Washington, D.C., a DuPont Circle neighborhood, 18th and R Streets. And our mission is to tell the stories of Jews in the American military going back before the revolution up to Afghanistan. And the museum was founded by the Jewish War Veterans Organization that have their roots with a group of Civil War vets.
Well, that's wonderful history, and you have a permanent exhibit on the Jewish Medal of Honor winners, which I found very interesting. That includes several from the war. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, or do you have someone you'd like to highlight as far as a participant, a Jewish participant in the conflict?
Sure. So our Medal of Honor recipients exhibit has 18 Jewish Medal of Honor recipients, and they're kind of the ones that can be confirmed Jewish. There's a lot of complicated issues figuring out who's a Jew or who's not, and trying to determine if they would have considered themselves Jewish, and it's a real challenge. But we have 18 on our current list, including 4 from the Civil War. One of the more interesting ones is Benjamin Levy, who was from New York. He was serving with the 1st New York Infantry at 17 years old. He's at the Battle of Glendale in Virginia in 1862. He's a drummer boy. And the story is that something happens in the course of the battle where his drum is destroyed, but his friend, his fellow soldier, has fallen ill. So Benjamin Levy sees his musket there. He grabs it, enters the fight, joins the fight as a soldier instead of the drummer boy. He spots their regiment's color bearer, then he's fallen. Levy grabs the flag, helps lead the charge, rally the regiment, and he is eventually awarded the Medal of Honor for these actions at Glendale. And then later on in the war, he re-enlists in 1864, eventually wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness, and goes on to live his life in New York. But he's one of the more interesting figures doing all that as a teenager. He was from New York. He was actually the only one of these Jewish Medal of Honor recipients born in this country. The other ones all came from what's now Germany or Central Europe. Later in the war, Abraham Cohen's one of those guys. He could come from Prussia, and he had actually served in the Prussian army while he was still living there. He comes here, joins up essentially right away as soon as he gets to this country, first serving with the 68th New York, and then eventually with the 6th New Hampshire Infantry. And his Medal of Honor award is for actions at both the Battle of the Wilderness and the mine or the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg. We actually do have his Medal of Honor here at the museum. The medal is here. And I'll just read the citation. During the Battle of the Wilderness, rallied and formed under heavy fire, disorganized and fleeing troops of different regiments. At Petersburg, Virginia, July 30th, 1864, bravely and coolly carried orders to the advanced line under severe fire. And then the other two are Leopold Karpeles and David Urbanski that we identify. There's some others like Eugene Jacobson, who appears to be Jewish, but we don't have him on our list. And you'll see more on some other lists. There's a lot of misidentification of people as Jewish who clearly were not, but those are the ones we have on our.
Well, I have to congratulate you. Your museum I have been to, and we very much enjoyed discovering it. I would call it a hidden gem. And when I was there, I noticed a section on the Jewish war veterans, which surprised me. I was not aware of the group. I was not aware of that history. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so the Jewish war veterans formed in 1896 with that group of Civil War veterans, and they're still working today, providing services, fighting for veterans benefits. Uh, the 1896 group, the Union veterans, form at least partly in response to the repeated claim that Jews did not fight in the Civil War. That comes about in the 1890s, 1890, 25th anniversary of the end of the war, a lot of looking back at the war, and a lot of the remembering becomes misremembering, or people applying their kind of 1890s ideas back to the 1860s. And so by the 1890s, there's been another wave of Jewish immigration. I mentioned prior to the Civil War, a lot of the Jews fighting in the Civil War are German or Central European immigrants. By the 1890s, we're talking about Russian and Eastern European immigrants, but the real large number of Jewish immigrants arising has brought about a wave of anti-Semitism, and that's applied in all kinds of ways. And in particular to what we're talking about here, that particular claim that Jews didn't fight in the Civil War gets repeated. There's some high-profile examples. A guy named J.M. Rogers wrote in the North American Review magazine in 1891. He said, "I had served in the field about 18 months, but I cannot remember meeting one Jew in uniform or hearing of any Jewish soldier. After the war, for 25 years, I was constantly engaged in traveling, always among old soldiers, but never found anyone who remembered serving with Jews." So that was the attitude. Another, even more high profile example that comes a couple years later is from Mark Twain in his essay called Concerning the Jew. And he writes, "The Jew makes a good civil servant, but has an unpatriotic disinclination to stand by the flag as a soldier." So that was the attitude of the times, and these guys grew tired of hearing it. They wanted to show they did fight in the Civil War. So in 1896, they put out a call looking for veterans of the Hebrew faith of the Civil War, and they gather and they form a veterans organization in New York.
I think a lot of people will be surprised to learn about this interesting history, especially in today's environment. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rugel, for all you're doing, and I hope everyone will be able to visit the museum. Let's expand and broaden our discussion now. I'd like to introduce everyone to Mr. Sniezek, who is at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I had the distinct pleasure to visit your institution a few years ago when you have a special exhibit, Passages Through the Fire, Jews in the American Civil War, that I thought was a very, very balanced historical exhibit. And I know it was a little bit before your time, but could you tell us a little bit of a background on the museum, the exhibit, and a little bit how it came to be?
Yeah, of course, happily. So this exhibit actually was formed by the American Jewish Historical Society and the Yeshiva University Museum up in New York as a sesquicentennial exhibit based around the Civil War. And it later led to this, a collection of essays and articles that culminated in the book, Passages to the Fire, which we still have here at the museum. And then as that exhibit was expanded upon up in New York, we reached out to the directors up there, and we secured the Passages to the Fire exhibit to be traveled down here to Baltimore at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. And one of the reasons why this is really cool and important is because the synagogue here that we have on our campus, the Lloyd Street Synagogue, is the third oldest synagogue in the country and the oldest standing synagogue in Maryland still. So we have, during that time, the exhibit was here for 4 or 5 months, and we had over 4,700 visitors come through. And that's in October to February, which anyone who knows Maryland weather knows that that is a very tricky time because there's a lot of snowstorms and ice storms here. And I know that in January, we had one of those ice storms that knocked the museum out of commission for like a couple weeks. So the fact that we had 4,700 people interested in learning about Jewish history was amazing for us.
Sounds like it was a great exhibit. What personalities or what were the big draws? We just heard about Benjamin Levy. When I visited, I was intrigued to learn about the Levy sisters. What were some favorite parts of the exhibit that people enjoyed seeing or learning about?
So people really enjoyed our Maryland spin that we put on it. So the synagogue that was here, the Lloyd Street Synagogue, it was written about in the newspapers here that there were two rabbis. There was Rabbi Bernard Elaway, who was a pro-secessionist rabbi, and then there was Rabbi David Einhorn, who was an anti-secessionist rabbi. And both of them had their own congregations. We have the synagogue on this side and the synagogue literally a block away right here, and they are both constantly bickering at each other. And they, at one point in 1861, they had this debate that went back and forth about the issue of secession and whether or not it was legal. And it got so heated down here in Mobtown that Rabbi Einhorn actually ended up fleeing in the middle of the night for fear of his life. So this is how, and this is one of the stories that we like to highlight because it shows that Jewish individuals were not a monolith during this time. They were molded by the people that were around them and the society that they were born or raised in.
That I do remember that exhibit. I also remember one that discussed General Order Number 11, which I think was surprising to me at the time. I had not heard about it. Did you get any? Did you get comments about that, or do you? I know you weren't there, but did that come up?
So I'm not exactly sure about the comments related to that. I know just generally people were very interested in learning about the Jewish history of the Civil War. But for those who don't know what General Order Number 11 was during the Civil War, it was an order issued by General Grant that stated, quote, "The Jews as a class violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury are hereby expelled from the department." And then later goes on to state that that Jewish individuals are not allowed to receive passes to become traders or for fear of breaking the law. And this order immediately received backlash in 1862, and President Lincoln himself ordered that this order be revoked. And for a lot of people, it was a surprise, especially coming from Grant, because a couple months prior, he had revoked several orders that specifically named Jewish individuals as being subservient or for expelling cotton speculators and Jews and other vagrants. So he had revoked General Order 8. And then out of the blue, boom, here comes this. And it wasn't until later when he was running for president that this order was brought back up by Democratic Jewish individuals trying to, say, hey, he's not a friend to Jews, that he actually commented on this in a leaked letter stating that, quote, "It would never have been issued if it had not been telegraphed the moment penned, without one moment's reflection." So it's very similar to sending that Facebook post or that text message that you don't want to send today and not think it through. It's very much based on hearsay, he says. So, yeah.
So what exhibits do you have now in the museum featuring this wartime history?
So we don't really have an exhibit that features the Civil War, but we do have in the base of our historic synagogue a history of the synagogue and the congregations that were in the building, which includes this debate between Einhorn and Elaway. And we're actually going to be doing a capital update project later this year, and that should be updated to reflect the current trends that we are experiencing within the museum. So
great. And where's the museum located again?
So we're in downtown Baltimore. We're on the corner of Lloyd and Lombard Street, or for those who want to use a GPS location, we're at 15 Lloyd Street. We are also known as the Downtown Museum, Downtown Synagogue. So feel free to look us up. The 15 Lloyd Street actually brings you to a free public parking across the street, which is big down here in Baltimore.
Well, thank you so much. Anti-Semitism is a perpetual worldwide concern, and it certainly seems to rear its ugly head perpetually throughout history. And any study of American history certainly has to include this topic. And some historians feel that American anti-Semitism reached a high watermark with that General Order number 11 and number 8. And we've covered it quite a lot already, Colonel Kennedy, thanks to Mr. Sniezek. But do you have anything you would like to add about General Order number 11 from a military historian point of view?
Well, I'd just like to say ditto, ditto, ditto to Mr. Sniezek. The genesis of the order was on the 17th of December, just after the Vicksburg campaign started. And as Grant's army moved south into north central Mississippi, he was having a number of problems with speculators and civilians coming in, and with military officers in the Union Army taking their position, and I know this is hard to believe, to conduct corrupt activities and steal cotton and speculate on it in their official positions. Now, I know in light of what's going on today, that's really hard to believe, right? That people would do that. But he was very frustrated with it. When his father showed up with a couple of Jewish businessmen from Cincinnati to ask for permission to get special licenses, that threw him into a tizzy. And I think the frustration brought out the latent anti-Semitism in him. And I don't think there's evidence he was actually anti-Jewish, but he used them as a convenient target. It was a knee-jerk reaction. And he said, because we've had some Jewish people speculate, and some of them do things that I consider unethical here, he wrote the order, number 11, and he used the words as a class. And he took the very specific situation and broadly applied it to everyone, whether or not they were traders or speculators, innocent Jews who lived in those regions that he was responsible for in Western Kentucky, Western Tennessee, and North Mississippi were all affected. And even Army officers took offense to this. They said, fine, we'll resign our commissions from the Army if you don't want Jews around. That's how they took it. And it was very insulting. In retrospect, years later, he says, really didn't mean to do that. Well, gosh, that's very convenient politically, but why would you do it in the first place? And I don't care what the pressure is, you just don't do that. There was another thing that's not talked about very much, is the Union Army policy on Jewish chaplains. Unlike the Confederacy, which allowed Jewish chaplains from day one of the war, the Union Army would not, until middle of 1862, after a number of politicians got involved with this, it became a big issue, allow for Jewish rabbis to act as chaplains. So there was a latent undercurrent of anti-Semitism there in the North. In the South, they were much more accepted. It's not that there was no anti-Semitism, but generally they were much more accepted. So General Order number 11 caused Grant massive problems for years after that, and it was questioned during his presidency. And I think he did the right thing. He went back and tried to fix it by actually putting people of the Jewish faith in positions of authority. But we have to remember that Jefferson Davis had Judah P. Benjamin, a prominent Jew and very smart man, in 3 different positions, ending up as a Secretary of State for the Confederacy. So he started off the war and into the war in a significant cabinet position.
Yes, and one thing that I have read, and maybe you can bring some intelligence or information about, was the role of the clergy in the military.
The chaplain corps was in its nascency, and what they did is they generally hired chaplains as civilians to act as the chaplain. It was years later that they started offering them commissions, so their rank was chaplain. And now we have chaplains that are chaplain colonel, whatever their name is, or chaplain captain, whatever their name is. Back then, they were just a chaplain. So they allowed them to come in because of the needs of the troops. And of course, famous in the North are the Irish American regiments, but the South had them as well. And they wanted their own chaplains, people that were able to minister their particular religious faith brought to their units. So it was very common for regiments to have their own chaplains, and they were paid for by the government. They weren't commissioned, they were paid for by the government, though.
And were rabbis allowed in both armies?
In the Confederate Army, from the day the first cannons fired at Fort Sumter until the end of the war, yes. In the Union Army, it wasn't until over a year after the war started that they were allowed to have rabbi chaplains in the Union Army.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, Colonel Kennedy, I would be surprised if most Americans, or very few, even historians, were aware of this dark side of U.S. military history. So thank you for sharing it with us.
You're welcome. And I graduated from a military school, and 50% of the first graduating class was Jewish. The answer is West Point. There were 2 people in the first class. One was Jewish.
That's a great piece of military history. Thank
Trivia.
you. Well, now we have already seen Michael Givens when we introduced our special guests. The society has learned that you are working on a documentary project about Jews in America. Would you be kind enough to give us a quick overview of the project?
Absolutely. This is a documentary about the first 2 waves of Jewish immigration to America. Oddly enough, most people don't know very much about this situation and this journey that was part of diaspora for Jews. And it's been a very enlightening journey for myself to learn about this. And there seems to be an awful lot of things that people are unaware of that Jews have accomplished, and what they've struggled against, and the trials and the tribulations that they had. And it seems that even today, even what I'm hearing now, that some of the story is a little different than what I'm finding. But it's very interesting. Most people, they really just know about the Jews coming to America basically after 1881, when about 3 million of them were released from Russia and Eastern Europe. But the first ones that came, which they started in about 1654, they came to America and mostly came to the South. And they were welcomed for the most part with open arms, and they had a pretty good shake of it. And that's really what the documentary is about, is to explain the story that most people don't know.
Well, that sounds exciting, especially I'm sure you'll be covering the war because that was so impactful in America. And as we heard from Mr. Sniezek at the museum, the pro and against, the rivalry, the fratricide that resulted within the Jewish community. What have you learned so far about the war, and have you uncovered any of this discussion of anti-Semitism that we've heard discussed so far?
Well, I think it's pretty hard to avoid anti-Semitism. You're gonna find that anywhere, and people are generally, they have their own ideas about their own sorts of people, and a lot of times they're just closed-minded. And basically, as a good and dear friend of mine who interviewed in this film pointed out, that it really just comes down to jealousy and arrogance. And that's really the crux of it. I'm not exactly sure if it was jealousy and arrogance that was driving Grant to push General Order Number 11 and the few things that he did before that, which were anti-Semitic. But I think he was trying to win a war, and it's hard to say. I mean, listening to the other gentleman talking about it, I have a slightly different view than what they do because of a few things that he did that were also anti-Semitic before he got to Orders Number 11. But I've learned a great deal about it, and there are some very, very interesting points that will be coming out in this documentary. And I got to tell you this, honestly, the documentary has become something much bigger than what it even started to be. When it began, it was really just a discussion of who are these people that first came to America, why did they come, and how did it work out for them. But then that led to a lot of other questions that became answered, that presented a much bigger, much deeper, much richer situation, that actually, when people see this, there will be things that will be very surprising to many people.
I had an occasion to see a sneak preview of a snippet of your film, and you discussed a prominent war veteran, Jewish war veteran from the South, in your opening remarks. Who was that, and can you tell us about him a little bit?
Well, I was talking about Moses Ezekiel because I want to tell you why, for me, that was so important. When I started doing this project, because there's this period goes basically, of course, we speak about biblical times as well, but by the time we get to them coming to America, it's the 1600s, and we stop our period basically at 1881. And so I figured what I would do with this is that I interviewed a lot of learned people that brought a lot of information to the table, and then I would use for B-roll to explain it, because our budget is not massive, so we couldn't afford to put actors and reenact scenes. That would cost millions of dollars. And so what I decided to do is to take artwork. And I have to tell you, this is one shocking thing that I learned, is that throughout the centuries, Jews have generally been regulated to certain jobs. And one thing that they have been kept out of for the most part is the art world. And my decision was that I'm just going to find all of this wonderful artwork that shows the home life of Jews and around the world, and their travels and their troubles and all of this stuff. It doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. There's very, very little of it. And Moses Ezekiel is one of the few Jews that was a practicing artist, that not only was he talented, he was extremely talented. He was also a soldier in the war. He was a cadet at VMI. He also was a color guard. We heard somebody speak about color guard earlier. He basically did almost the same story with a flag when he was a cadet. And then he was a pallbearer for Stonewall Jackson. But he created a monument that is incredibly important, because that war that split our country up, by the end of it, and you have to remember how many human beings lost their lives because of that. You can call it a misunderstanding, you can call it whatever you like, but a lot of people died. And at the end of it, when there were all these soldiers that had been buried at Arlington Cemetery, which incidentally used to be Robert E. Lee's home, Moses Ezekiel designed a statue to go there to represent reunification of the country coming back together. And oddly enough, and believe it or not, there are people today that want to tear this thing down. He's the only Jewish artist that made anything like this. You know, it's like impossible for me to find any paintings, much less statues. I mean, he also did some really wonderful busts as well of soldiers and officers in the Confederacy. But the point is that he made this for reunification. And it is right now in danger of being torn down. And if it gets torn down, that will be one of the largest, most loudest acts of anti-Semitism that this country has ever witnessed, because that represents the coming together of this country.
I sort of have to pause and just let that sink in a minute.
Well, listen, I want to go there to shoot some film of it to add to the end of the film, and I'm told that there's a quite a bit of construction equipment around it right now, and the reason that I spoke to somebody that's near it that I was having to get stock footage from because I can't go and fly a drone over it and get a shot of it, and it's got all this construction equipment around it, which I'm told is probably there being prepared to tear it down, and I find that sickening.
I think probably most people on this program today agree with you. Well, thank you for this important information.
Well, thank you. And let me just say the name of the film is This Happy Land, and it's going to be a 3-episode series that will be coming out soon. And stay in touch, and you'll hear all about it.
Well, that's my question: is how would we stay in touch, and when would we be able to see it?
Well, if you would like, I could put the contact info where people can. You can look it up on IMDb. You can follow my my website and see what's going on, and I'll put that in the chat if you would like. That
would be terrific. Well, we look so much forward to seeing the documentary, and please keep the society informed, and we'll include that link in our distribution.
Great, thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. You mentioned one of the folks you interviewed, and we're so lucky to have Dr. Michael Kogan with us today. Dr. Kogan, we just heard about a Jewish Confederate, Moses Ezekiel. Was he an anomaly?
Not at all. The Jewish people of the South threw themselves into the war effort, and I'll tell some anecdotes about that. With great enthusiasm, including my great-great-grandfather. They fought because their homes, as they said in their own autobiographies and memoirs, they fought because their homes were being invaded, and they were fighting for their country against an invader. And they were shopkeepers, or some of them farmers, but their land was at stake. Their country was at stake. President Eisenhower kept a picture of Robert E. Lee in his Oval Office for 8 years. And when somebody came in and said, well, wasn't he a traitor? President Eisenhower responded that between the 1789 and 1865, there was a great dispute over whether one's first loyalty lay to one's state, and the states preceded the Union and created it for their mutual benefit, or was your first loyalty to the Union? Now, that was settled by the war between the states, but before that, men of education and probity and honor debated the question. So if you chose the Union loyalty, as most people did in the North, you weren't betraying your state. And if you chose the ultimate state loyalty, you weren't betraying the Union. It was just a matter of priorities. And in the South, it was really the state which was primary. And that hurt the Confederacy too. Jefferson Davis and Judah P. Benjamin believed very much in the Confederacy and the central government of the Confederacy. Most people had, in the South, a dim idea of the Confederacy. They were fighting for Georgia or South Carolina or Alabama. And if you look at Confederate monuments, around the South, many of them say these died for their state. And if you look in Boston and elsewhere, it'll say these died for the Union. A very different idea of how America was constructed and which came first, the state or the Union. Well, the answer is 13 states came first. But then what about the other states that came after the Union? It was a big, formed, it's a big dispute. Well, Jewish people in the South rallied around the cause, whether they had been pro-union or pro-secession beforehand. And we find their names in a number of records and memoirs expressing their views, and many went off to war. How many Jews fought in the war between the states? Well, Robert E. Lee said he had 10,000 Jewish soldiers, writing to Rabbi Michelbacher of Virginia, who wanted them to go on leave to celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And he said, Rabbi, I can't spare them. I've got 10,000 here, but if you will send rabbis to the camps, we will give you a place and a time to have your religious services for the high holy days. Well, he said 10,000, and God forbid that I might disagree with General Lee. The way I was raised, he was a saint, a portrait in our home who seemed to be part of our family. And in any case, historians have estimated as low as 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. So it's somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000. We really don't know. As was said before, sometimes it's hard to know who's Jewish or who isn't. You go by the name, but you really don't know the religious practice. In any case, many were very enthusiastic and were lauded by their commanding officers for their heroism in action. A forebear of mine raised a cavalry company in Sumter, and he fought throughout the war and became his Rangers became part of Hampton's Legion, and he was Major Moise, Edwin Moise, and he later served in the administration of Wade Hampton when the South was liberated from the yoke of Reconstruction, and Wade Hampton elected governor, and Major Moise became the Adjutant General of South Carolina. So he served the South all his life.
Could you spell that? Could you spell that?
Moise, Moise, the French form of Moses. Now that I named Moses, let me talk about some other people connected to my family. Women got involved in the war in a very profound way. One was Octavia Harvey Moses, who had, I believe, 17 children. And when the war broke out, 5 of her sons went off to fight. 2 of them were killed. One at 18 years old, Perry Moses, who's buried in the Hebrew Cemetery in Columbia. And she was unshaken in her love of the South. She was a poetess, among other things. And after the loss of her 2 sons, and her 3rd son was in a Yankee prison and affected his health for the rest of his life. After those losses, she, the poet, wrote this: O land of the South, be thy soil ever sacred, enriched as it is by the blood of the brave. To thee our love, to thy foes our hatred, thou birthplace of heroes, of martyrs the grave. And that, I think, expressed the views of many Southern women. The Daughters of the Confederacy, which is, and various monument associations, put monuments to Confederate soldiers all over the South. And Jewish women, including Octavia Harvey Moses, were very involved in the erection of those statues, which are now being attacked in a kind of Confederophobia, in which some people want large chunks of history wiped out.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dr. Kogan. You segued circuitously right into Dr. McLean, who is going to pick up with that and talk a little bit about Moses Ezekiel and his endangered monument. Dr. McLean, as a Virginia artist and art historian, tell me about your introduction to, and I think that Dr. Kogan mentioned the United Daughters of Confederacy. I believe this is one of their projects.
Yes,
So
it was. Yes, it was. And it's been so interesting hearing everyone, the coming together after this bloody conflict where 700,000 died and our nation was ripped apart by, and I really liked the way Mr. Kogan talked about the different conceptions of what was your country, either your state or that, we didn't come after Britain into a full empire. There were many that believed their state was their country. So that was really what was settled at the point of a bayonet. But I have been just so, I didn't realize it. I grew up around a Moses Ezekiel statue in Charlottesville in front of the rotunda of Thomas Jefferson. Moses Ezekiel was the first Jewish cadet, as I think Michael Givens just said. And his roommate was Thomas Garland Jefferson, who was one of the 10 young boys at the Battle of Newmarket on May 15th of, 1864, who died. And so that was just devastating for the young Sergeant Moses Ezekiel. And he ended up meeting Robert E. Lee and Mrs. Lee in Lexington after the war and got to know them a little bit. And Moses Ezekiel was going to be a doctor, but he decided, Lee actually said, since he was artistic and had this great talent, to go apply himself and go to Europe and study. And he opened a studio in Berlin and he practiced and practiced, and he's done some amazing works. So this monument is just a magnum opus, I guess you could say. Just, it's a tour de force, beautiful piece, 32.5 feet tall. It has 32 full life figures. And you see Moses Ezekiel's great skill with the human form. And it's got babies and older people and men and women. And it's integrated black and white. And it was his lived experience of the South. But it's a very much a reconciliation monument.
Michael Givens mentioned that it's endangered. Was this part of that naming commission?
Yes, we're very worried because, this naming commission, they've chosen 1,111 Confederate items throughout the South to just obliterate in a Taliban-esque effort to, erase history, which is reprehensible to me. This is not an American way. I mean, it's been 150 years, and all the soldiers deserve recognition from North and South if they gave their lives. So this is a very inhumane, I just can't even believe that our own government, we have to protect this from the Department of Defense. I really think that that's maladjusted spiritual formation on the part of those that are trying to do this. And everyone should call their congressman to protect this amazing grave marker for Moses Ezekiel. This was found, I guess it was dedicated in 1914. And President Wilson said this was an emblem of a united people. This is a peace monument. And after this bloody, awful war, brother against brother, families torn apart, those people came back together and said, this American experiment is so worth going forward with, and we will forgive. And there are 489, I guess, graves around this. Every president gave a wreath to it, and even Obama, but then it stopped after that. And we have a new enemy afoot here in America, and I think we need to look very closely at what's happening. We should not destroy fine art, especially it'd be sort of like taking Michelangelo's David and it's, taking it down and just, by moving this, if they move this, which is, by the way, Moses Ezekiel's headstone. And he has a cousin who's also buried close by. That is a very anti-Semitic act, and I just think a real barbaric act.
Well, I see we're our time is slipping away from us. I'm going to open it up sort of in the opening order, just for a final comment. You know, we sort of started at the beginning of Memorial Day, and we're sort of ending up on a note of, are we going to continue memorializing? And so, Mr. Jones, do you have any parting thoughts for the viewers today or the media?
I do not. I just think Memorial Day is one of our most significant holidays, and we need to. Somehow it has become, in my mind, too associated with sales and barbecue. That's an old-fashioned
we
thought.
thank you for participating to emphasize the importance of it today.
Enjoyed it. I've learned a lot today.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Rugel.
Yeah, so I hope people can come visit the museum in Washington, D.C. We're at 1811 R Street, Northwest, and visit the website. Briefly, let me just, I have a much different perspective than the rest of you on Ezekiel and the monument. And I haven't even heard anyone address the problematic issue, and that's that Ezekiel presents these glorified images of slavery. He presents the loyal slave, the happy slave, the glad mammy, and that is the issue people have with the memorial. It's not just that it's a Confederate memorial. So I think that has to be addressed when discussing the Ezekiel memorial. So I don't know if you could come up or come down, but in many ways, the memorial does a real disservice because it presents a dishonest view of the Civil War, of the Confederacy. It tells us a lot about lost cause ideology, so we certainly would lose that history. But the imagery of slavery is really the problem with the Ezekiel monument, not that it's a Confederate memorial.
Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Sniezek.
Yep, I also want to agree with that. It's been a lot studying on it as well, and I agree with a lot of what Mr. Rugel said. But also, I want to, support the museum here and suggest that, if you are in Baltimore area, we are a nice, small, little tiny museum. Again, free parking, always a plus. Happily, would love to see people down here. Yeah.
Well, thank you for participating. Thank you so much. Okay, Colonel Kennedy, any parting shots?
Yes, I'll play the part of Rabbi Einhorn, and Einhorn, of course, differed in opinion. I believe the Arlington Monument to the Confederacy is a soldier's monument, not a political monument. So I disagree. I think it's strictly within the confines of the context of the society of the times. I think it was a beautiful memorial. The last thing I put on there is a comment about the book by Robert N. Rosen. I highly recommend. It's called The Jewish Confederates, and it was written about 22 years ago, but it's a great work.
Yeah, it's actually a bit a thick, very thick one, and I believe Dr. Kogan's family is discussed in there, if I remember my reading correctly. Okay, Mr. Givens.
Well, I must say I appreciate you bringing us together for a friendly debate, but I have some serious opposition to them taking that statue down. If you're going to take down everything that had any touch to slavery, which of course was not invented by Americans, much less Southerners, we will destroy everything in this country. We will destroy everything in the world if we take everything down that's been touched by slavery. And I suppose we just shouldn't learn from it. If it's, I certainly see it as a bad thing. I wouldn't want it. I wouldn't want to be it. I wouldn't want to own any, but it happened. And that's not why the man designed that, to celebrate slavery. So you have to remember it for what it was. I would suggest that you look at the suggestion in the chat that Jack Shule put up, that it would be nice if perhaps we could have some people that would like to do it to sign on to a letter to help protect that monument if it does any good. And it's awfully good to see Michael Kogan.
Well, this is a Memorial Day, Anti-Semitism Day program. So, or excuse me, Jewish History Month program. So we're learning a lot about Jewish history, and we're learning a lot about memorialism, and we have some interesting views. But Dr. Logan, you're up next.
The Ezekiel Monument of Reconciliation and Peace has scores of small images around it, bas-reliefs, etc. And among them is a enslaved person, the nurse, the baby of the house, holding up the baby so that his father in uniform going off to war can kiss his forehead. And if that's an insult, I understand how. Around that statue are all those graves of Confederates. What do we do next? Tear up their headstones? What after that? Do we exhume the bodies and cast them to the winds because they might have owned slaves or been in favor of slavery? What about the statues of George Washington and of Thomas Jefferson and of Madison, who gave us our Constitution? All slave owners, no good, throw them out. They're the fathers of our country. And people, it is an academic error, an intellectual error, to demand that people of the 19th century think about race, gender, and other things in the way we of the 21st century think of it. Most white people were racist until the civil rights movement began to bring Black and white people together. And people learned if you sit on a bus next to a Black person, the sky won't fall. And people now work very happily together, Black and white, certainly in my city of Charleston. There's not enough socializing together yet, but that will come. And we'll hit the day when the color of a man's skin doesn't matter any more than the color of his hair. And that's what we're aiming at. But people in the 19th century, to hold them to 21st century standards is intellectually dishonest and academically invalid.
Thank you, Doctor. And Dr. McLean, you'll be our closing. We run over a little bit, but you'll be our closing.
I just want to thank everyone for these thoughts and especially highlight what Mr. Kogan just said. I wholeheartedly agree. There's slavery today in places, and there's also there was a lot of love that is never celebrated or talked about between families. And I think that was, and no one's saying that slavery is right, of course, but there are worse things that happened in Africa. There was, cannibalism and, some very unsavory things. But at the base of this monument, it says, not for fame or reward, not for place or rank, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty as they understood it. These men suffered all, sacrificed all, dared all, and died. And so we should remember their sacrifice. And the images show every family that experiences war on their homeland, they get torn apart. It harms everyone. It's a terrible thing, but this is a representation that is a piece of artwork. And we shouldn't destroy the artwork by applying today's standards to something before. And I just want to highlight that. So thank you for everything.
Well, I would like to thank all our guests and all our participants for participating in the Society of Preservation of Jewish Civil War History, and sending best wishes to Rabbi. And we hope everyone enjoyed the webinar today, Understanding the Complicated History of American Jews in Civil War, America's Civil War. Thank you to all. Be well.